everyone, and thank you so much for joining World Now. I'm Jim Falk, and as always, I am so grateful to the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, especially its president, Megan Torrey, and Abby Noyes, who helps co-produce our program. And a special shout out to the World Affairs Councils of America. In fact, its president, Matthew Hughes, happens to be visiting me this week in Santa Fe, and also got to thank him for bringing in the rain and thunder. And mentioning that, believe it or not, here at home, we lost power a few hours ago, got that back, then we lost the internet. So Megan Torrey is standing by and will pinch hit if that becomes necessary. And of course, I want to thank all of the organizations and members of the World Affairs Councils for supporting our program. And it really is a special privilege to have on the show tonight Elliot Ackerman. He's a friend, and I really can't think of very many people who have the knowledge and just the talent to convey warfare, American foreign policy that he does. He is an author that I have followed for a number of years. In fact, I hope you can see the 4 or 5 books that I have on my bookshelf, and that was just in my office. I know there are others floating around the home as well. Elliot is a former U.S. Marine. I guess you never say former for a Marine, do you? But he served 5 combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. And obviously this really shaped a lot of how he writes today. He's a recipient of the Silver Star, the Bronze Star for Valor, Purple Heart, and he later served as a White House Fellow working with veterans at that time. A prolific writer. His articles have appeared in major publications, The Atlantic, The New York Times, and now he's spending a lot of his work is published in the Free Press and many other leading publications. In addition to many novels and nonfiction works, as you know, he has co-authored 3 books with retired Admiral James Stavridis. The latest is 2084. And we're going to be focusing on that in the beginning of our conversation. And then I thought you, our listeners and viewers, would like us to broaden the conversation. And I'm going to ask you to help us do that. So be sure to put in your questions into the Q&A area of the Zoom box. And I ask that you not put it in the chat because that scrolls, as I often mention, and it's very difficult for Elliot and me to follow it. So let's get started. Elliot, wonderful to see you. Thanks again.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me, Jim. Really appreciate it.
So I know in many interviews you're always asked these same questions, and we'll start with that, but I think our listeners and viewers want to know, how did you and the Admiral get acquainted? I know you're both graduates of Fletcher, but how did you connect on these books?
Sure. We were both graduates of the Fletcher School, although we were never there at the same time. And then when Jim retired from the Navy, he became the dean of the Fletcher School. And we got to know each other just sort of as alums. And he asked me at one point to be the writer in residence at Fletcher for a semester. And I asked him, I said, what does that entail? And he sort of, like the military officer and a naval officer he gave me sort of a bulletized memo of everything.
I can hear him saying, I have 3 points I want to make.
3 points. And one of them was talk with the dean about books when he feels like it. So I only bring that up because, we've been friends. We also sort of, I kind of understood his sensibilities, and he is like a very wide reader. I mean, we would talk about, he'd be interested in books about, politics and history, but also, the latest novels that had come out. He kind of reads everything. So I only bring that up in the context of our friendship because then a couple of years later, I got an email from my editor at Penguin Press, said, hey, let's catch up, grab lunch. And he sort of, he pitched me over lunch. He's like, I have this one writer I work with, and he, is interested in, writing a book that would sort of imagine what it would look like if the U.S. and China went to war. He's done some great nonfiction, but he's never done fiction. I thought this could be a really good opportunity for you to maybe team up with him. His name's Admiral James Stavridis. Do you know him? I'm like, oh, I know Jim. And so that was sort of, so our editor, Scott Moyers at Penguin Press, who's edited all 3 of those books, he played matchmaker for us on the project. But I'd be the first to tell you that, just because you're friends with someone does not mean you should enter into a nearly decades-long literary partnership together. And particularly when that friend was the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. And I definitely didn't want to be in a position where I was sort of, arguing with him about adverbs. We both said, okay, let's see how this would go. And we kind of talked about, what a first chapter of the book would look like. And so we said, let's, do a test run. And so we wrote the first chapter of what was 2034 together. And that was a great experience. And we just sort of kept on doing it, crafting each one of these books sort of chapter by chapter, and what's been a really, for me, deeply, meaningful and wonderful collaboration up to 2084, which just came out this past May.
Yeah, not all dates lead to marriage.
No, that's true. That is true.
So how do you all? Because I think it's always interesting to see how people who work together to get on co-author a book. How do you work together? Do you share chapters? Do you say you write this chapter, I'm going to write the next, or do you plot it out at the very beginning?
Well, to channel Jim, I'd say two things. One, a lot of back and forth, and two, a lot of drinks. So, usually the way we do it is we'll kind of outline the chapters, outline the book, but really we've written them chapter by chapter. We'll outline a chapter. We'll go back and forth over Zoom, kind of talking about what's going to happen, where we're at in the story, what we need to integrate, what themes, not only themes of the story, but also the kind of the geopolitical themes that we want to be touching on. And then once we sort of get to a point where we feel like that's pretty baked, one of us will take a first crack at the chapter. Typically, it's me, and then I'll send him, my first pass. He'll send me his pass back, and we kind of bat it back and forth, either in person or sometimes over Zoom. Oftentimes having a cocktail together as we figure out our sort of story meetings. And then once we feel like the chapter is pretty cooked, we kind of move to the next, and that's how we wrote all three books.
When you started this process, did you have in your mind that you were going to write more than one book and create a series? And will there be a fourth?
I didn't necessarily know that it would be a series, but I mean, in pretty short order, it became kind of evident to us that there were sort of three issues that we wanted to tackle. The first in 2034 was this idea of a peer level war with China and what that would look like. 2054 was this idea of the rise of artificial intelligence and the fault lines that sort of exist in our domestic politics and in a democracy. And the third book, 2084, deals with sort of a deep future of war, but also the impact that climate and changing geography will have geopolitically, probably towards the end of this century. And I say those three big challenges because, talking amongst the two of us, those were really the three challenges that we saw facing kind of the globe in the 21st century. So we thought it would be a great, sort of thought experiment to try to tell the story about each one of those challenges.
And let me give you the opportunity to tell folks that they don't need to start with 2034. They could read 2084 and then see how great that is and go back in time.
Yeah, they don't. Like each of the books stands on its own, and we very intentionally wrote them that way. So if you pick up 2084, like you're not going to be lost. That being said, as much as the books, have, as I just mentioned, these sort of top line kind of geopolitical, technological themes to them, fundamentally too, like they are an intergenerational story. So, I think a lot of readers will probably come to these books because they're interested in those themes. But our hope has always been that they'll stay because they'll get involved with the characters. Like, for instance, Admiral Sarah Hunt, who the first book basically opens with her, and her progeny, her daughter, who is only glimpsed at the end of the first book, is one of the central characters, is a much older woman in the last book, 2084. And so for us, and when we first started working together, one of the things, and wanting to do the project was we had to have a similar vision. And our vision has always been that these stories, really the engine in them is that they're character-driven stories that are intergenerational across the century.
I read a recent profile that you were featured in, and the word came up, journalism. Or is Elliot Ackerman a journalist, or is he a author? What's the difference in your view about, or how do you self-describe yourself?
I don't think there's a lot of difference. And I frankly don't spend a lot of time thinking about the difference. I write a lot of nonfiction too, and I write a lot of journalism. Like you mentioned, some of the places that I write for. For me, kind of fundamentally, it's about storytelling. It's like, how do you tell a good story? What serves the story? So there are um, a number of my novels that I could, point to and say, if you look in these books, I can sort of show you my journalism a roadmap of everything that is in these novels. This part actually really happened to me, and then I sort of made this part up. And oftentimes in my writing, what I have found is that the journalism will feed the fiction writing that I do, and it keeps me out in the world. It keeps me present in the world in a way that I like, and I think helps my writing.
Do you have a preference? Nonfiction,
Um,
fiction? No.
no, I really don't, and I think the tools that you use are often very similar. I think all writers are really like readers first. And for me, when I'm working on a book, my North Star is I'm trying to write the type of book that I would enjoy reading. And I think the types of books that I enjoy reading are the ones that tell a great story, that are generous with the reader and give the reader room to draw his or her own conclusions.
Well,
Um,
one thing too with when you're writing fiction, you are able to develop characters so much more deeply than you can if you're writing nonfiction, I think, in some
Well,
ways.
nonfiction, right? Nonfiction, one of the things you sort of lack is like the same degree of interiority in a character. I'm not going to be able to tell thoughts in the same way. But at the same time, too, like there are tools that you can deploy in journalism and nonfiction that are a little bit more difficult to employ in fiction. So there's just I feel a lot of overlap in both, and like fundamentally, I'm just trying to write a good article or a good book.
Yeah. We are about to switch over, I think, and talk about some current events, and there is no shortage of things to talk about. But let me just remind people to send in questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Yeah, I go back a number of decades when I was at University of Virginia, and my professor was an Iranian American, Rui Ramazani. And if it was not the first class, it was probably at least the second, where we talked about the Strait of Hormuz and the whole concept of looking at a map and choke points. And I just want to get your thoughts about how we continue to fall into certain traps in the formation of our foreign policy, mistakes that are made. I mean, people now are saying the U.S. government started the war in Iran. There's so many people in the government that were opposed to this or would have approached it in a different way. Why do you think we continue to fall into sand traps?
Well, I mean, they call it the iron dice of war for a reason. I mean, throughout history, it's a fundamentally extremely risky enterprise, and decisive wars, wars that have a decisive outcome, victory or defeat, are actually frequently not the norm. Usually, the outcome of a war, if you look at history, is sort of not necessarily decisive or satisfying. Um, so, uh, but I guess I would answer it. I think oftentimes we as Americans will lose track of the fact that war is fundamentally a political action, and that if the political conditions aren't set for victory, it's very difficult to use the military as a tool to affect that victory. And I think, as Americans, we are rightly so enamored by the professionalism, technological prowess of our military. But just because we have that prowess and just because we have the finest fighting force that has ever walked the planet does not mean we will win wars. And you see that over and over again when the politics aren't set. So, like, for instance, in the war in Iran right now, I think one of the great challenges is, we have governments. You have the United States government. The United States, we are fighting a limited war in Iran. It's not existential to us. Whether we win or lose the war in Iran, the United States will continue to exist. If you are the Iranian government, not the Iranian people or the nation of Iran or Persia, but you're the Iranian government, whether or not you win or lose the war in Iran is existential. So you're not fighting a limited war, you are fighting a total war. So if you lose, you will be annihilated. So if we just look historically, when you look at the politics around war, when one side is fighting a limited war and the other side is fighting a total war, it's very difficult for the side that's fighting a limited war to be triumphant because they're not willing to do absolutely anything to win.
Iraq and Afghanistan are different, but there are similarities.
Sure, I mean, similarities for if you were the Taliban, the war was a total war. I mean, you had the fanaticism of Al Qaeda in Iraq, so similarities there. All the way back to the Vietnam War. So I think for the U.S., oftentimes if you look at least our track record post Second World War, when you look at why wars haven't worked out, I think oftentimes not oftentimes, I think almost exclusively actually the answers are not military answers. It's not like, oh, well, our tanks weren't strong enough or our troops weren't well trained enough. The answer is always a political answer. And it seems that seems to be a lesson that we keep forgetting. We go to war thinking we're going to win for military reasons, and then when we don't win, we look back and say, "Oh, we didn't win for political reasons." Maybe we need to put the political first, and then think about the military afterwards.
I know you've put your feet in a bit of domestic politics, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but it certainly seems as if Congress continues to abdicate its responsibility. And it's been that way for a while. How can that change, and how important is that?
But I mean, I think domestically in the United States, like we there's not one clean fix. I mean, I think at this moment since 2024, it would seem that the politics have been such in the Republican Party that Congress has abdicated that role. Um, our democracy doesn't work well when all three branches of government aren't fulfilling their obligations. Um, but I think one of the things about American society is, we have elections every 2 years. In some ways, we are like a revolutionary society in so much as there are constantly these incredibly dramatic swings in our politics. And that process of sort of almost like, if it almost feels like continual revolution. I mean, right, we're sitting here at 2026. 2.5 years ago, we were living in Joe Biden's America. And that seems, at least to me, I'll say that seems like a very, very long time ago psychically for me. And so probably in another couple of years, we'll be living in a very different America. And so I think I'll just speak for myself. As an American, I was sort of raised to understand that my nation and our nation that we were a young people, that we're kind of an upstart, plucky nation, and that's true. We are a young people, but if you look at our system of government, we're a very old nation actually, as a democracy. We've endured, for 250 years now this year. What other countries can you point at around the globe and say they've had the same system of government for 250 years? China can't say that. Germany can't say that. I mean, Iran can't say that. So we're sort of a young people with an old system of government. And that old system of government, has worked well. So as much as I share a lot of people's frustrations and concerns. I'm also very bullish about America and our ability to course correct.
Let me bring in Rick, and it goes back to what you said a few moments ago about the essential threats. Would you agree that the war with Iran is existential for Israel, and what implications does that have for the United States? Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Rick. I would agree. I think the war in Iran and the October attacks against Israel are existential for the nation of Israel. And I think oftentimes, as Americans and outsiders, we sort of struggle to understand Israel's actions because we filter them sort of through an American lens in which war is typically limited and not total and not existential. So I would agree with that. For me, it's not difficult to understand that if were I living in Israel or serving in the IDF, that I would see this war as existential in a way that an American service member probably doesn't, or American citizen doesn't.
Staying on Iran just for another moment, if you were called into the Oval Office right now, what advice would you have?
Oh, geez. I think my advice would be to understand that all this military action is fundamentally political. That you have to keep your eye squarely on what a political outcome is. I think another challenge is understanding who you are negotiating with inside the Iranian regime, because Mojtaba Khamenei has not been seen since this war began, and I think a lot of the dissonance that the Trump administration is experiencing right now is because there isn't one sort of coherent decision-making body. So I think just understanding the challenges that entails, I would encourage a lot of patience, and I would be leaning very, very heavily on my diplomats and members of my intelligence service to really want to understand what is going on internally in Iran right now.
I saw an article yesterday in the Financial Times. There's one sent it to me. I'm not sure when it was published. It was recent, saying that 50% of our embassies now do not have an ambassador. And I'm sure you're talking to a lot of people in the foreign policy establishment. How much, what is the degree, what is the impact of what we've seen with the dismantling of USAID and certainly now obvious reductions in talent in and participation from the State Department.
Well, I mean, I think you're basically seeing, the Trump administration showed up and they interpreted their mandate to dismantle a lot of the bureaucracy that existed in the United States. And we are seeing the outcome of that, which is that a lot of these sort of career civil servants and agencies have been dismantled. A number of civil servants are retiring, and there's a real schism, I think, that exists within the career civil service and the Trump administration. And so when it comes to sort of the just grinding work of diplomacy, we're seeing the fallout of that. And, yes, as you mentioned, in the fact that 50% of embassies don't have an ambassador, and in some of the diplomatic kind of false starts that have occurred around the war in Iran.
Let me bring in David. Proxy wars in this day and age have a great way of testing out new technologies, letting the United States know what technologies have promise. And can you comment on what we're seeing with the wars in Ukraine and Iran?
Well, I think we've seen that. I mean, I think we've seen obviously in the war in Ukraine how quickly the cycle of technological innovation and then a countermeasure and then more innovation has been. So I think we haven't seen, the war in Iran is a different beast than the war in Ukraine, although you've seen the proliferation of drones there. And I think that the United States technologically, we're in a position right now where a lot of our legacy platforms and the efficacy of those legacy platforms are being questioned. I mean, you have in Ukraine, I think Russia's Black Sea fleet, 70% of that fleet has been sunk or damaged in the war in Ukraine. And that's against a nation that has no navy. So I think the United States Navy in particular needs to be put on notice that some of these extremely exquisite we have could be vulnerable. And I think the U.S. military understands that intellectually. But I think what's so difficult is that, you have a defense acquisition cycle that is not necessarily as responsive as we need it to be. And, and there's a lot of work going on right now to try to rectify that, but it's a slow process.
Andy, thanks for your question, because it was exactly where I wanted to go. And Andy's asking about drones and what we're seeing now with warfare that is so asymmetrical. Whether you have a drone that costs $15,000, $20,000 that's being shot down by a defensive missile that costs $10-15 million. Andy adds, in the U.S., it seems like we're in a huge catch-up mode with a great mismatch between our weaponry and those inexpensive drones. Is there other technology that's disruptive that perhaps we're not on top of? And what do we do about warfare that is so out of balance?
I think the first stop is, again, having a defense industrial base that that is responsive in any type of future war. There was a while ago, I was meeting with a gentleman like 3 or 4 years ago, and we were kind of talking about this very problem, and we're talking about it in the context of China, and he was making that sort of point, about gaps that existed in our defense industrial base and the way the Chinese were catching up. And I sort of made the point, and I said, yes, I mean, that's all true. But, when you really look at like the most exquisite advanced technologies and platforms, like those all come out of the United States. Like we are, the iPhone might be built in China, but it's conceived in the United States. And I made that point, which is a point I've heard, many other people made. And his countered that, which I think is absolutely correct. He said, listen, Elliot, he's like, in World War II, what was the nation that made the most exquisite technology? Who had the best tanks, the best fighters, the best missiles? So it wasn't the United States. It was Germany. But Germany did not have the ability or the capacity to bring those technologies to scale. So, the way we beat the Germans was with, crappy Sherman tanks and, planes that were good enough, but built at an absolutely massive scale. And the challenge that we face today as Americans is sort of we are in the role of the Germans with regards to the exquisite technology, and the Chinese now have the industrial capacity to crank out the 90% solution at a volume that we can't do. So I think, intellectually, I think the last 5 years there are a lot of people who have woken up to this, but, we're still not there as a country, and we need to be.
Oh, I saw that you were talking recently about magazine depth, and at first I didn't quite understand the term, but of course that's related to supply chain, and we're seeing that now with Patriot missiles and mixed messages about whether or not we could quickly replace what we've lost, and do we have what we need, and can we ramp up our manufacturing fast enough?
Right. I mean, and these are all, obviously complex issues that deal with our supply chain, but we haven't. I mean, we've seen, for instance, in the war in Ukraine, we haven't had the ability to, as Americans, to supply the Ukrainians with the volume of drones that they need at a reasonable price point. So, American drones, we can't send enough of them, and they're too expensive. And yes, we do have good drones, but they're too expensive. And we don't have enough of them to help our Ukrainian allies. So, who do they buy their drones from? They buy their drones from the Chinese at 1/10 of the price and at the volume that they need. Now that creates a problem. Right now, like the Chinese have allowed them to buy these off-the-shelf drones that have been very effective. But were the Chinese to sort of shut that down, then we as NATO, as Ukraine's ally, would have an issue because we wouldn't be able to get them the volume of drones they need to sustain themselves on the battlefield.
Let me bring in, and this is an anonymous question. How do you think the U.S. military feels about President Trump's decisions? And do you think that there would ever be a refusal to follow illegal actions, and this person adds extrajudicial killings of fishing and drug boats of another country?
I mean, my experience that the U.S. military is not a monolith. I mean, it's an incredibly, diverse institution with people of all political stripes. So I think the real question is, let's never place the U.S. military in a position where a question is posed to them about legality, where people have to sort of show their cards or come down on one side or the other of an issue in a very stark way. The culture of the U.S. military, at least when I served in it, and it still seems this way to me, is that it's not that people who wear the uniform don't have political opinions, political leanings. They absolutely do. But there's an incredibly strong culture of omerta. Like you don't speak it. It's not something you talk about. That's for you. I'll tell you to this day, like I have, great buddies of mine who I served with, and we're all veterans now. But we all wore the uniform together. These are my very best friends. I actually don't even know what their politics are because we sort of have these old habits that we just don't talk politics, and we're better friends because of it. So I think that culture is very strong in the U.S. military, and that we need elected leaders who aren't going to, take actions and walk right up to the line in a way that puts our service members in a compromised position. We owe them better than that.
That's a good point. Did you by chance see the recent article in the Atlantic by Tom Nichols, The Timidity of America's Top Generals?
I think I did see this, but remind me.
Well, it was interesting because what he said was that because of the termination, reassignments of so many generals and others that are leaving military service, that while we do have the civilian leadership, our military should feel comfortable that they can express their views, even if they are contrary to what is being espoused at the time by the administration. And I'm wondering if you have any sense or concern about that and evidence that perhaps that's happening.
I think what I would say, Jim, and this is something I have seen that concerns me in the military and in the civil service, is that people, career officers or civil servants who are not political and have gone to great pains throughout their careers to be nonpartisan are forced into having a partisan or given a partisan taint because they work in one administration or another by no fault of their own, just through the timing. They happen to be, you become a four-star general, and it just so happens that President Biden was president when that happened in your career. So now you're a Biden person.
Yeah.
And I think that is a real problem because what it does is it robs us of our civil servants and career military officers who just have a real depth of knowledge and expertise that the entire nation can draw from. And it makes it impossible for transformational, once in a generation leaders like someone like a Bob Gates to emerge, because the second you work for one president or one side, it means you can never work for the other. And furthermore, then the other side will come and attack you. And I think that is really too bad, and it's not in the best interest of our country.
And I want to be sure to give Dan a response to his question, and maybe you'll want to elaborate a bit more on this, Elliot. Dan says, are we losing the skilled leadership as we see so many senior generals leaving at such a fast rate? And I would add to that, I was talking to a retired general last week who said that a lot of mid-career people now are giving the service or thinking about leaving when they had planned to make it a career.
Listen, I don't think I don't want to speak for the entire U.S. military, so kind of, I mean, I think there are always anecdotes, and that doesn't mean they're not true. But what I will say categorically is that like depoliticization of the U.S. military and a democracy is a bad thing. You can go back to from Caesar's Rome to Napoleon's France. When you start doing that, and when you have a highly politicized military, it does not end well for a democracy. Now, whether that corresponds in the last 2 years to higher officer, to officer retention issues, and we can look at the details, but just painting with a broad brushstroke, our country our democracy and republic with its large volunteer military only works if the politics are not in the ranks. And if it doesn't, as the founding fathers knew, it becomes a real liability to our country. You do not want a large standing politicized military in a democracy.
With our all-volunteer Army, do you think that we really ought to be looking at, I'm not going to say conscription in a draft, but at least some form of national service?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I've written about this. I believed for a long time that some type of a draft, that we should have a draft. Now, when you say draft in America, most people's minds go to sort of, mandatory. Every single 18-year-old male, is either heading into uniform, or every 18-year-old young person has to do some type of national public service. I don't think that would be appropriate, but I think that if we were to have a draft where, let's say, 5% of the volunteer military were conscripted. So you're talking about like basically the size of the Coast Guard sprinkled throughout the services. I think that would have a salutatory effect for our democracy. I think it would make people pay attention to the issues of war and peace and foreign policy in a way that they don't right now. If they knew that their 18-year-old son or daughter had a 1 in 20 or 1 in 30 chance of needing to do 2 years in the military, I think that would be healthy for us. And I've written about. I wrote a story for Time Magazine a number of years about this. So I'm not optimistic that it will happen. I don't think it's politically too popular, but I think it would be healthy.
We're going to mention and have mentioned a number of your articles, and let me just encourage people to go to your website, and we'll put it in the show notes, because there are links to not everything you've written, but certainly a great number. Pellin says, piggybacking off our ability to produce weapons at scale, what do you think, Elliot, about what do you think of our steel production in Japan's hands as necessary?
I think we have to, I think onshoring as much as we can possibly onshore makes sense, particularly if we need to kind of surge our, industrial base, in the event that we were to have a peer level war. But I think that also needs to be balanced kind of with the realities of a globalized economy as we live in it. So I'm not overly concerned about, what's been going on in Japan, but I think we, post Cold War, definitely took our eye off the ball in terms of how much manufacturing is going on in the United States. And to sort of what I was saying before, like we need to have that capacity so we're not in the position of Germany in World War II with the inability to mass produce weapons at scale and innovate at scale and speed. Because speed, people talk about warfare in terms of air, land, and sea, but time is also a maneuver space, and speed is critically important.
And on that, Andy goes with this question. The legacy companies, the big five in the military-industrial complex that continue to have a monopoly, he says, on our defense supply to this date. What do we do about innovation in tech? The Apple as an example, I guess some of the things being done by Palantir and others. The translation to the defense sector, given the industry structure, it seems to be more of an aspiration. I think he's alluding to move away from the legacy companies.
Well, I think you're seeing, you're definitely seeing that that there are a number of upstart defense companies that are doing really amazing work and are pushing the legacy companies kind of to operate in new ways and are now competing with them. So companies like Anduril is one. Castillon is a hypersonic rocket company that was founded with a lot of the original folks from SpaceX. And for many of these defense companies, they're one of their key value propositions is the fact that they can create at a lower cost and higher volume better weapon systems than the traditional big five weapons manufacturers companies. So I think one of the great things, and I think a bit of good news in our American system is we're a system that's designed that where there is demand, competition can be introduced into the system, and we're starting to see that in the defense space. So again, there's a lot of work to be done, but I remain optimistic that we're going to be able to do it.
Wes, who lives in Connecticut, is asking about AI and autonomy, what we're seeing in Ukraine and Iran. How does that inform potential current or future military operational policy, the decisions? In short, where are humans in the kill chain?
Well, I think, and this is absolutely, a huge live wire is the question of where are humans going to exist in the kill chain as you have, swarming technologies that are being pioneered right now, and you have actors on the other side, in China and Russia and others that don't have the same type of sort of moral qualms that the United States have of having, fully autonomous robots that are authorized to kill. So this sort of stop getting out of the realm a little bit of strategy and tactics into the realm of philosophy. And the question too, is where when you put in an anti-tank mine, where's the human in the kill chain there? You bury the thing, you go away, and you hope the tank shows up. So these are significant questions that are being asked now. I think the Trump administration just updated its policy on where humans are at in the kill chain, and it wouldn't surprise me if we get pulled more towards sort of the direction that countries like China are moving, where there is less and less human interaction in the kill chain. But I think we should be resistant to that and asking questions all along the way of how it might compromise us.
Okay, this is interesting because one of our guests says, "Hey, talk about the book." And so another question here is, we in the book you do talk about this a closer relationship between China and the United States. Is that realistic given the current relationship? And how does climate change affect that? And let me just say to our audience, one of the most challenging things for a moderator is how to handle talking to someone who's written a great suspense thriller without giving away too much. But I'll leave it in your good hands, Elliot, to
Sure.
talk more about the
I'll
book.
just sort of set the table for 2084. And one thing I would say too is all three of these books, they're not supposed to be works of prediction, they're works of speculation. So we're just speculating what the future could look like. And we think doing that imaginative work is a great way to prevent some of these worst case outcomes. But in 2084, what we imagine is that there's been significant climate change, and that sort of the equatorial band around the globe has become uninhabitable due to either flooding or dramatic increases in temperature, and that you have a certain group of nations that have really suffered under climate change, nations like Nigeria, Brazil, Indonesia, that are heavily populated. And then you have more sort of classically northern industrialized countries like the United States, China, who have caused a lot of climate change through their industrialization, but have fared better. So the tension in the book is between the countries that have suffered, they form an alliance called the reparationists, and that they're demanding climate reparations and land from the consortium, the United States and China. And so that book opens with that initial tension, and the reparationists are making a move on the consortium to take back land they feel is theirs.
And there's also a wonderful discussion about how climate can truly be manipulated.
Absolutely. Towards the end, we talk about how climate can be manipulated. And then fundamentally, too, right? Climate Why do we care about climate? Because it changes migration and it changes geography, right? And anyone who studied war understands that like geography is destiny. If you want to understand war, you have to understand geography. How land factors into a battle, how the oceans factor into trade and strategic positions of nations. So we're basically imagining a war that's been ravaged and changed by climate, but it's also one that's had its geography fundamentally changed, and so that creates new possibilities.
You've spent so many years thinking about issues like this, and you mention, and so does the Admiral, that this book is, as you describe, cautionary fiction. Could you explain or elaborate what you mean by that?
I think, going back to kind of the spirit behind, the first book, 2034, and that's sort of been a North Star for this entire series, is when we were writing 2034, one of the vacuums we felt we were writing into was that, I'm a child of the 1980s, and so I'm old enough to remember kind of the rich Cold War storytelling that existed in our culture. I mean, everything from books like, Fail Safe or On the Beach to movies like, Red Dawn, or one of my personal favorites, Rocky IV. Like, we were always sort of imagining how we were going to be doing battle with our Cold War adversaries. And in many ways, as much as like a World War III against the Soviet Union, it was so deeply imagined. The one thing we could agree upon with our Soviet adversary was that no one wanted to fight the war because we thought about it so much and how horrible it would be. So if you sort of believed, as we did, that we were either in the foothills of a Cold War with China or in a Cold War with China, that imagining how catastrophic that war would be was a great first step in avoiding the war. And so we began 2034 with that in mind. But then that spirit's also gone through 2054 and 2084, sort of imagining the challenge and then talking about and telling a story about sort of some worst case outcomes has a salutatory effect. It helps you avoid those outcomes, because so often in a history of war, whether it's Pearl Harbor or 9/11, the wars begin because of failure of imagination. So, let's do the imaginative work up front and tell a great story. And I tell people, they often don't believe me, but like, as much as the books deal with these sort of cataclysmic events, they're also, I think, a lot of fun. So,
yeah. One of our guests here says, there's a lot of talk tonight about war. What about peace? And let me rephrase that in a way to ask, what do we do about the architecture of peace that seems to get second thrift now?
Well, I think it's important to, be reminded that, sort of how freedom isn't free. I mean, peace isn't free either. Like the peace and the golden age that we have lived through, as much as it's had its turbulent periods, but really since, the end of the Second World War, is built upon international norms and institutions. And I would caution anyone to be too precipitous in just wanting to sort of throw those into the dustbin for, casual reasons of why they think they don't work. We need to take care of those institutions. They've served us very, very well over decades, and I think that's how you achieve peace. You invest in these types of long-term international organizations, because anything else is just chaos.
Elliot, I read an article you wrote, I guess about a year or two ago, where you endorsed the idea of the Department of War. And I have to say that surprised me. Do you still feel that way, that was an appropriate change?
Well, frankly, I was sort of talking about it before it was cool. So I was making a different argument about the Department of War, in so much as that it would be healthy to not have this stark civil military divide that exists in this country, where there is constantly simmering wars. And I get to this sort of, in my discussion of the draft. If you look at every war the United States has fought since its founding, we've needed a construct to sustain that war. I mean that broadly speaking in two terms: blood, who's going to fight the war, and treasure, how are you going to pay for it? So if you look at, like, for instance, the Civil War, right? The blood for the Civil War, the first draft the U.S. ever had was during the U.S. Civil War, and the first income tax came out of the Civil War. And that goes to the Second World War, right? You have the blood, a massive national conscription, treasure war bond drives, Vietnam, characterized by a very unpopular draft. So you get to the war on terror, and the construct we use to sustain that war is the blood comes from our all volunteer military, and the treasure comes from our national deficit. And the result of that is sort of the American people become anesthetized to the war. It's not something that really affects us unless, we have someone in the military or in the military ourselves. So when I wrote that piece about the Department of War, the argument I was making was that, we need to speak more clearly. Like when the nation's at war, the nation needs to know that it's at war. And we need to know that this is what this department does. And that any language we use that kind of takes the edge off of war and war making isn't in the best interest of our country, because it probably serves to prolong wars. Like for instance, in 2018, there was an election there was a poll Rasmussen put in the field about the war in Afghanistan. And when the American people were asked, 44% of Americans, it wasn't they were for or against the war. They couldn't even say in 2018 whether or not the war in Afghanistan was still going on. They'd just forgotten about it. So my argument for the Department of War was basically that, if we have a department and this is what they do, they make war, that would hopefully focus our minds. I think the way the current administration has dealt with renaming the Department of War has been with a lot more chest thumping and braggadocio, which kind of isn't really my style, and wasn't why I was making the argument that we should rename it to the Department of War. So now I guess I take it back, because it wasn't done the way that I hoped it would be done.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense, and I'm glad I gave you the opportunity to talk about it, because it did surprise me. I just realized we haven't talked about the Fifth Act, and that is such a powerful book about the war in Afghanistan, and particularly how we treated the Afghan service members and who worked alongside our military. And if my memory serves me right, you were on a nice vacation in Italy, August 21, when all this happened. Give us an update about where we are with the special immigrant visas, and what can our listeners and viewers who are concerned about the status of Afghan refugees, what can they do?
I think those who are concerned about the status of Afghan, refugees, I think it's just get involved in your community. Every community is different. So many of our Afghan partners have fanned out across the country now. There are pockets in, but Texas actually a whole number in Texas, Northern Virginia. But I think, in your community, that is usually the best way to get involved. And then I think, when it comes to what do we owe our Afghan partners, sort of, I think it gets into this larger question of immigration. What do we owe the people who come here, legally, who want to be Americans? And I think it says a great deal about us and how we treat those folks. And I think there are a lot of Afghans I served alongside who, in their sacrifices that they made, the clarity of vision they have for the types of lives they want to lead, themselves and for their family, and their ideals are, more American than a lot of Americans that I've met. And so now that so many of them are here, I think, what we owe them is a fair shake and a fair pathway and to become citizens. The Fifth Act was a book. You mentioned I was on vacation. I didn't mention my vacation in the book because I think anyone cares about my family vacation. I mentioned it to show sort of the stark juxtaposition of, I think, so many veterans felt, where we had kind of served in the wars and, come home, made our peace, and we're kind of living lives pretty far removed. But the way that war ended and the haphazard, disorganized way that it ended, sucked so many people back into the war and trying to evacuate folks. And so I wanted to write about having that experience myself because, I thought it was one that might, resonate with other veterans.
Well, it certainly did, and I encourage people to read that as well as Sheepdogs. Mentioning Sheepdogs, we'll be able to see that on the big screen.
We're working on it, yeah. So we're working on it. I'm working on that project with Playtone, which is Tom Hanks and Carrie Getzman. It's their production company. So can't say more than that, but it's in the pipeline right now, and it's been a lot of fun.
Well, I can't wait. Let me be sure to bring in Ray Termini, very thoughtful member of many World Affairs Councils across the country. And he asks, how important is historical literacy in helping students distinguish between legitimate criticism of government and hatred of a people? Is lack of critical thinking a danger to the U.S.'s ability to develop effective public policy?
I'm glad you asked that question. I mean, a great question and a great point. Yes. I mean, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it, as the old axiom goes. And I think that any democracy is only as strong and as healthy as the virtue of its people. I mean, virtue being, what are our values as a country? How educated are we? How literate are we? How much do we understand history? How much do we understand our obligations to this country? And if we feel that we have no real obligation to this country, well, then we don't have a country, because at the end of the day, particularly in a republic like ours, it's just a collective. It is all of us. It's nobody else. So yes, the education of our young people and the civic literacy, not only of our young people but of all of us, is critically important. If we don't have that, then we don't have a country.
I think if we had been talking in January, we'd have said Cuba is next on the list. And many people think that there may be military action in Cuba or effort to change the regime once Iran perhaps is put to bed, whenever that may be. Is Cuba perhaps an example where we might think it's just too easy and we ought to be imagining a different path?
I mean, certainly. I mean, listen, the United States has a long history with Cuba, to include one failed attempt of regime change at the Bay of Pigs. So that one might not necessarily be as easy as we think. And I think there's war is incredibly seductive. It's very seductive to believe that a military action can, in one foul swoop, solve all of the administration's problems, or create a sort of very neat corrective to geopolitical challenges that have dogged the world for decades. And what's so seductive is sometimes it works, but more often than not, it doesn't work, and you wind up with a mess. And I think that we're seeing that in Iran. We certainly saw that in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the norm is usually that the quick, lightning fast, elegant solution is not what comes to pass. So I think we should be very cautious about that in Cuba.
And perhaps it's more seductive when you're not having many casualties, although all, of course, are precious.
Absolutely. Very seductive.
Let me bring in and combine two questions. And one is America losing its influence on the world stage? And then John Wong says, is China benefiting from the U.S. war in Iran?
I think one of the well, I think China is benefiting from the fact that I think the war in Iran is showing some of the limits of U.S. military power as it can affect political change, and is also, frankly, just seeing some of the limits that exist around U.S. military power and the projection of U.S. military power as it would relate to any direct action that China might take against Taiwan. So, yes, I think that in many ways, the war in Iran has been good for China, although, China has, suffered the same sort of economic pain that the whole world has been facing in this. But in addition to that, U.S. military adventurism, and when we kind of have an undisciplined approach to it, it benefits our adversaries. I mean, I think one of the key strategic points, if we talk about the rise of China in the first quarter of the century, is the fact that the United States was completely preoccupied by, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And by the time we were no longer fixated on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we looked up and realized that we had a peer level adversary in China.
Elliot, are you still involved with what's the name of the Ford Party, and what's your work in domestic politics now?
No, I'm not. I don't do anything politically.
Okay, but you did a few years ago, right?
About a decade plus ago, I mean, actually 15 years ago, I worked on an initiative that was trying to get an independent candidate to run for president. We did some interesting work, but were ultimately unsuccessful. So,
do you think it's still impossible to do?
I don't think it's impossible to do. I actually think, I mean, if we talk domestically, I think one of the things that's happened in the last 10 or 15 years is that the the actual structures or the party structures around the Democratic and Republican Party have never been weaker. And the power of external groups and individual actors to put their thumbs on the scale of our politics has never been greater. So were someone to want to run as an independent and were they to be sufficiently funded, that pathway exists in a way that it didn't exist 25 years ago.
You know, we've talked about a lot of issues, and most of those have been ones on the front page. What's not on the front page that you're thinking about and that we should all be considering?
I think that issue, the way our politics, like just the mechanics and structures of our politics have changed, and some, recent Supreme Court decisions in the last, 5 to 10 years have could potentially be transformational in our politics. And I think, maybe this one is on the front page, but sort of and we addressed this in 2054 and in 2084, is sort of the integration of biology and technology and how that is happening so quickly. The work that companies like Neuralink have done, and the idea that you could integrate that type of technology. For those who aren't familiar with it, Neuralink is basically doing a lot of work in the integration of technology into your brain, so that they've already have individuals who can control a computer cursor with their thoughts. So taking that to the next level, and these sort of ideas of like transhumanism and what that would look like. And as much as it sounds very sort of sci-fi, I think those are some really big questions that are going to be coming down the pike as quickly as AI sort of plopped itself into all of our lives.
We have a question here about the impact of rare earth metals, and could that be a causation of war, and how might it go about? Come about?
I think obviously, it could, because anytime there's scarcity around any type of, critical resource, it can become a cause for war. If we look at the beginning of the Second World War from the U.S. perspective and Japanese perspective, that was fundamentally, a competition around oil and Japan's ability to get oil, and that led to Pearl Harbor. So I don't think we're there yet with rare earth metals, but the need and the appetite for these rare earth metals is only growing, and it's an issue that I'm certainly keeping my eye on.
Another comment from Connecticut. Not a lot of talk tonight about Space Force. Will they play a role? And maybe that'll be the more about your next book.
Yes, listen, I think absolutely, Space Force plays a role because, that's, satellite communications, cyber, these are all, critical frontiers in the next level of war. And I think one of although Space Force itself doesn't play a role in the series of books, in 2034, if you pick it up, you'll see that there's significant conversation of what happens when militaries that rely on high-tech equipment can no longer rely on that high-tech equipment. And maybe the best way to fight a high-tech adversary is by going low-tech. Get yourself off the GPS, maybe get yourself back onto a compass and map. And we used to be able to fight that way. Those are perishable skills. But parts of the U.S. military are reinvesting in those skills. I know, for instance, that for a long time, sort of classic, map sextant navigation was no longer being taught, and now it's being taught again for that very reason, that you in a future war against a peer-level adversary, you might not be able to rely on your GPS.
And this is what makes it so intriguing, because when you're looking at what manpower needs are going to be needed 50 years from now, it's so hard to project.
Very, very hard to predict, but in our work we try to speculate.
Elliot Ackerman, as always, golly, it's nice to see you again. Congratulations on the book. And I really do want to encourage people not just to read 2084, but take a look at all the books Elliot has read. It'll really bring back a lot of memories about the forever wars and make you really appreciate the service of our men and women who are in the military and working in other areas of foreign policy. We got some great programs coming up over the course of the next few months. Just confirmed with Peter Bergen. He'll be talking about his book that's coming out in late September, All the President's Wars. I've seen a galley of it. You all are all going to want to be on that call. The World Ahead, again, with Tom Standage. That'll be on December 3rd. And just confirmed today, but we got to work out the date, one of my favorite authors, Elliot, I hope you read David McCluskey. He's really good. London Station, great espionage novel. So we'll see you next time. And as always, thanks so much for participating with World Now. And if you have some ideas about other speakers you'd like to hear, just send me an email. Until next time, I'm Jim Falk.